In Stalin's empire, loyalty was a currency more valuable than love, and far deadlier to keep. Among the men who served him, few were as loyal as Vyacheslav Molotov. He was the perfect Soviet, silent, disciplined, obedient. To Stalin, he was not just a minister, he was a shadow. But in the end, even shadows cannot hide from the light of fear. Because one day, Stalin turned not against Molotov, but against the woman Molotov loved most. Her name was Polina Zhemchuzhina, a revolutionary, a minister, and the wife of one of the most powerful men in the USSR. She spoke too freely, she was too intelligent, and in Stalin's world, that was enough to make her dangerous. When Stalin ordered her arrest, Molotov did not resist. He bowed his head and remained silent. As historian Simon Sebag Montefiore once wrote, Molotov was Stalin's truest believer and his most broken disciple. This is the story of a man who gave everything, his honor, his love, his soul, to serve a dictator. Before he was Stalin's loyal deputy, Vyacheslav Molotov was a quiet, methodical man who believed the revolution was a science, and he was one of its engineers. Born Vyacheslav Skryabin in 1890, he adopted the name Molotov, meaning hammer, as a symbol of strength. He joined the Bolsheviks early, before the 1917 revolution, and became known for his calm precision and his ability to obey without hesitation. When other revolutionaries shouted, Molotov listened. When others argued with Lenin, Molotov nodded. And when Joseph Stalin began to rise within the party, Molotov became one of his earliest allies. By the 1920s, Stalin noticed his usefulness. Molotov had no ego, no ambition that challenged him, only an almost mechanical loyalty. Stalin made him General Secretary of the Communist Party in 1930, and later Foreign Minister. But behind the loyalty was something colder, devotion without conscience. Historian Robert Service described Molotov as a bureaucrat of terror, a man who could sign death lists as calmly as meeting minutes. Under his supervision, purges were formalized, votes for execution were conducted with efficiency, and the state's cruelty became a system. Yet, even in this world of blood and fear, Molotov believed he was building socialism. And Stalin rewarded him with trust few men ever received. They dined together. They smoked together. They toasted to the revolution and to each other. To outsiders, they were inseparable. But those who knew Stalin understood. Closeness to him was never safety. It was only proximity to danger. Molotov's loyalty made him powerful. Soon, that same loyalty would demand the ultimate test, one that would force him to choose between his devotion to Stalin and the woman who shared his soul. Her name was Polina Zhemchuzhina, the Pearl. She was more than Vyacheslav Molotov's wife. She was a revolutionary in her own right, strong, articulate, and one of the few women who could speak freely around Stalin. Polina was Jewish, cultured, and outspoken, everything Stalin's inner circle secretly feared. She worked in Soviet industry, helping manage the textile sector, and had built her own place within the party's elite. But by the late 1930s, the ground beneath Moscow began to shift. The Great Purge was consuming the party from within, and Stalin's paranoia was now a living thing, growing, watching, whispering. He began to see plots everywhere, and whispers started reaching him about Polina. She talks too much. She has friends abroad. She's unreliable. Historian Simon Sebag Montefiore wrote, "To Stalin, suspicion was not a flaw, it was a method. And Polina's independence became her crime. It didn't matter that Molotov was one of Stalin's oldest comrades. It didn't matter that Polina had served the party loyally for decades." One evening in 1948, agents from the MGB, the secret police, came to their apartment. Molotov wasn't there. Polina was taken away quietly, without a word. No charges were announced. No explanation was given. When Molotov returned home, the apartment was silent. Only her shoes remained by the door. The next morning, Molotov arrived at Stalin's office. He stood there, pale, hands trembling, waiting for some explanation. But Stalin didn't even look up from his desk. He simply said, "We all have to make sacrifices for the party." And Molotov, the loyal hammer of the revolution, bowed his head and said quietly, "Yes, Comrade Stalin." That was it. He never asked again, never protested, never mentioned her name in Stalin's presence. Polina was sent to the Gulag, accused of Zionist sympathies and anti-Soviet conversations. Her only real crime was being married to a man Stalin wanted to test. Molotov, the man who had sent thousands to their deaths without blinking, was now living the terror he once administered. But the story was far from over. Polina would survive the camps. And one day, her husband would face the question every loyal man must answer. When does loyalty become guilt? It was March 1953. Joseph Stalin, the man who ruled with terror for 3 decades, was dead. The tyrant who had demanded obedience, silence, and sacrifice was gone. And with his death, the great machine of repression began to sputter. Doors long sealed began to creak open. Prisoners were released. Files were burned. And one of the names on the release list was Polina Zhemchuzhina. After 5 years in the Gulag, she returned to Moscow, older, thinner, but unbroken. Her health was frail, her spirit scarred, but her eyes, still sharp, still defiant. Historian Robert Service described her return as a moment of quiet reckoning, not for Stalin, but for those who had served him without question. When Polina stepped out of the car, Molotov was waiting at the entrance of their apartment building, the same place from which she had been taken away. He looked smaller now, the once powerful foreign minister of the Soviet Union, the man who signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, who defended Stalin at every turn, was now just an old man waiting for forgiveness. She didn't say anything at first. She looked at him, this man who had loved her, and yet had not lifted a single finger to save her. After a long silence, Polina whispered, "Why, Vyacheslav? Why didn't you stop him?" Molotov's answer was quiet. "Because no one could." Molotov lived the rest of his life defending Stalin. Even after his wife's suffering, even after the blood and purges, even after the truth was undeniable. He said, years later, in an interview, "Stalin was a great man. He sometimes made mistakes, but who doesn't?" That single line tells the story of Vyacheslav Molotov better than any history book could. He was the perfect servant, loyal beyond logic, faithful beyond morality, a man who watched his world collapse and still called it justice. Polina died in 1970. Molotov followed her a few years later. They never escaped Stalin's shadow. Not in life, not in memory. History remembers dictators for their cruelty. But sometimes, the most chilling stories are not about the tyrants. They're about the men who loved them too much to say no. In Stalin's Soviet Union, loyalty wasn't a virtue. It was a weapon, forged by fear, sharpened by silence. Vyacheslav Molotov was the embodiment of that loyalty. He defended the purges, he signed the orders, he justified the lies. And when Stalin turned on his wife, he stayed quiet. Historian Anne Applebaum once wrote, "In totalitarian systems, the most loyal are often the most broken." Molotov never broke publicly, but every word he spoke after Stalin's death carried the weight of guilt he could never admit. Even in old age, when journalists asked him if he regretted serving Stalin, he replied, "No, history will judge us." But history already has. Molotov's name, once feared across continents, is now remembered as the symbol of blind obedience. Stalin didn't need believers. He needed mirrors. Men like Molotov who reflected his will, even when it destroyed the people they loved. And that's the tragedy of Vyacheslav Molotov. Not that he followed a dictator, but that he became one in his heart. The Soviet Empire was built by monsters, but it was sustained by men who mistook fear for faith,